I was babysitting for the Vance family, a lonely farmhouse swallowed by corn so tall you couldn't even see the main road. It was the summer of 1982. Mr. Vance told me only one thing before they left. If you hear laughter in the fields, do not turn off the porch lights. It sounded like a rural superstition, but in that graveyard silence of the countryside, even the faint scent of rotting corn felt like a warning. Little Lucy was a perfect child until 10 o'clock struck. Suddenly, she froze, tilted her head toward the window, and whispered, "They're here. They want to play hide and seek." I looked out, but I only saw black stalks swaying in the wind. Then I heard it, a quiet, childish giggle coming directly from the thick field. But Lucy was the only child for 10 miles. I went to check the door lock and noticed a small handprint on the glass, but it was on the outside. I tried to lead Lucy upstairs, but she tore away and pointed to the kitchen door that led straight into the fields. It was wide open. A cold draft swept through the room and the porch lights began to flicker. In the middle of the kitchen lay a track, not human, but something that looked like a foot made of husks and dirt. I ran to the porch to shut the door, but it was too late. Figures began to emerge from the corn. They weren't children. They were things as tall as adults, but their bodies were woven from twisted corn stalks. Instead of faces, they had crude burlap masks stitched to their plant-like necks with rusty wire. I turned off the porch lights by accident. It was a mistake. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by the sound of thousands of dry leaves rubbing together. The things began to circle the house. I heard their fingers, sharp as sickles, scratching against the wooden walls. Lucy stood in the middle of the living room and began to sing a harvest song. Her voice sounded hollow, as if speaking through a mask. I fled with her into the pantry and barricaded the door with a heavy cabinet. I heard those things break inside. Their steps were heavy and wet. One of them stopped right outside the pantry door. Through a crack, I saw a cornstalk snaking inside, twisting like a snake, searching for us. A human eye was grown into it. I knew we couldn't stay there. I grabbed Lucy and crawled through a small vent window outside, directly into the fields. I thought we'd be safe in the corn, but the field was their kingdom. The stalks closed in around us like prison bars. Every movement hurt, as if the plants were cutting me. Then I tripped over something hard. It was a skeleton in children's clothes. Lucy looked at me and her eyes were suddenly pitch black. "You're not the one hiding," she said. "You're the one being sown." At that moment, roots erupted from the ground and began to wrap around my ankles. They dragged me down into the black, damp earth. I saw one of those masked things leaning over me, holding an old, rusty sickle. I screamed and tore myself away with all my strength. I ran toward where I sensed the road was, while the field roared with anger behind me. I burst onto the asphalt just as a local sheriff's car was passing. When he found me, I was covered in dirt and my pockets were filled with hundreds of dried corn kernels. The Vance house was empty in the morning. No Lucy, no parents. The sheriff told me that house had been abandoned for 20 years since the Great Drought. But I know what I saw. To this day, I can't walk past a cornfield without hearing that quiet, rustling laughter. And sometimes, when I wake up, I find a fresh corn leaf in my bed. It was 1974, and the Miller estate was the kind of house that felt like it was holding its breath. It sat at the end of a long, unlit gravel road, surrounded by oaks that clawed at the gray sky. Mr. and Mrs. Miller were late-night people, academics who left me with their 6-year-old son, Toby, and a list of rules that seemed more like warnings. The most important one was, do not, under any circumstances, open the heavy velvet curtains in the nursery. Toby was a quiet child, the kind who stared at corners as if watching something move. After I tucked him in, I sat in the downstairs parlor, the only sound being the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. Around midnight, the phone rang. When I answered, there was no voice, only the sound of wet, rhythmic breathing and a faint, metallic scraping. I hung up, my skin crawling, and checked the locks. Everything was sealed. But when I looked up at the ceiling, I saw a dark, damp stain spreading directly above me. The stain was coming from the nursery. I ran upstairs, my heart thumping against my ribs. Toby was fast asleep, but the room was freezing. The air smelled of stagnant pond water. I looked at the nursery window, where the heavy velvet curtains were twitching, not from a graft, but as if something was standing behind them, leaning against the glass. I remembered the rule, but then I saw a small, pale hand with unnaturally long fingers peeking out from the fabric. I grabbed Toby and backed toward the door, but the wardrobe in the corner creaked open. It wasn't empty. A figure was hunched inside, folded in ways a human body shouldn't be. It was wearing a tattered black suit, but the skin on its face was gray and translucent, stretched over a skull that had no nose and no ears. Its eyes were just two wide, hollow pits filled with thick, black oil. The creature stepped out, its limbs unfolding with a series of wet, sickening pops. It was nearly 7 feet tall, its head scraping against the ceiling. It didn't scream. It began to whistle, a low, distorted version of the lullaby I had sung to Toby earlier. I realized the breathing I heard on the phone hadn't been a prank. The creature had been in the house the whole time, watching from the shadows of the rafters. I bolted down the stairs, Toby screaming in my arms. I reached the front door, but the brass handle was glowing red hot. I couldn't touch it. I turned back, and the creature was at the top of the stairs, not walking but descending in a jerky, frame-by-frame motion. It dropped a small object that rolled down the steps and stopped at my feet. It was Toby's favorite teddy bear, but its head had been replaced with a shriveled human heart. I ran for the kitchen, looking for the cellar key. The walls were starting to weep that same dark oil I saw in the creature's eyes. I found the cellar door, but as I opened it, I realized the stairs were gone. There was only a vertical shaft that dropped into a pit of writhing, pale limbs. The tall guest was behind me now. I could feel its freezing breath on the back of my neck. It whispered in a voice that sounded like dry leaves. "He's not yours to keep. He was promised to the house before he was born." It reached out, and its fingers began to lengthen, turning into thin, sharpened needles. I did the only thing I could. I smashed the kitchen window with a chair and leaped out into the rain, clutching Toby. We ran through the mud, never looking back at the house. As we reached the road, I looked up at the nursery window one last time. The curtains were wide open, and the tall guest was standing there, waving a pale, multi-jointed hand. The Millers were never found. The house was empty when the police arrived, except for one thing. In the nursery, they found my own driver's license pinned to the wall with a silver needle. Beside it, written in oil, were the words, "We'll need a new sitter soon." I still can't sleep in the dark, and every time I see a red curtain, I see those hollow, oily eyes. Babysitting for the Sterling family was supposed to be easy money. Their house was an architectural gem from the late 19th century, filled with dark wood, high ceilings, and hallways that ended in impenetrable shadows. I was 19, and back then, in 1979, I believed the greatest danger of the night was boredom. The Sterlings went to the opera and left me with 5-year-old Emily in a house that smelled of beeswax and something old, reminiscent of dried funeral flowers. Emily was a quiet child. All evening she drew in the living room, but her pictures were strange. She didn't draw houses or suns. She drew faceless figures sitting at a large black object. When I asked her what it was, she just pointed a finger at the ceiling and whispered, "The lady in the dust wants to play, but she has no fingers." At that moment, the first faint metallic chime echoed through the house. It sounded like a piano, but the Sterlings didn't have a piano, at least not on the ground floor. Emily looked at me with her big eyes, and I felt the first wave of real fear. The sound was coming from the attic, a place I was forbidden to go. The Sterlings emphasized that they had the attic key with them, yet the music continued, a slow, painful melody that sounded like someone trying to play an instrument that was years out of tune and rusted. I took Emily's hand and decided to check the house to make sure all the doors were locked. In the dining room, I came across an old portrait of the original owner. She was a pale woman with fingers so long they looked like spider legs. Her gaze followed me across the room. I noticed in the painting she was holding a small silver key. When I looked closer, I saw a real, fresh tear leaking from her eye. The music from the attic intensified. Now it wasn't just a melody, it was a frantic chaos of notes, as if someone was pounding the keys in a fit of rage. Emily let go of me and began walking toward the stairs. Her movements were jerky, unnatural. I tried to stop her, but when she turned to me, her face was blank. The skin was stretched over the bone, and her lips were sewn with fine, silver wire. I screamed and ran after her, but the staircase began to stretch beneath my feet. There were suddenly hundreds of steps. When I finally reached the attic door, I found it open. There was no furniture inside, just a massive, grand piano in the center of the room. The piano was covered in a layer of dust thick as snow, but the keys were moving on their own. Sitting at the instrument was a figure in a tattered dress, but instead of hands, she had only sharp bone stumps. The figure slowly turned. It wasn't a dress she was wearing, it was her own skin, stripped and hanging in tatters. Instead of eyes, she had only empty sockets from which dry dust poured. Emily stood beside her, reaching out her hands as if she wanted to be buried. The figure opened its mouth, and a sound of grinding metal came out. "I need new hands," she creaked, and her bone stumps began to lengthen toward me. I wanted to run, but the attic floor began to turn into black keys. Every step I took triggered a deafening tone that tore at my ears. I felt the fingers on my hands beginning to stretch, bones snapping and skin tightening until my palms looked like those in the portrait. The figure at the piano began to laugh, a sound like thousands of snapping strings. Her face began to change, and suddenly she looked exactly like me. Emily caught my leg, and her grip was icy. "Play with us," she whispered, even though her mouth was still sewn shut. At that moment, the piano opened, and I saw what was inside instead of strings. There were stretched human tendons, thousands of thin fibers that vibrated with every note. The entire instrument was built from human bodies artistically folded into the shape of a grand piano. I gathered the last of my strength and kicked Emily away. I threw myself at the attic window and crashed through the glass. I fell for an eternity while the Sterling house shrank above me into a single black dot. When I hit the lawn, I wasn't dead. I was covered in blood and glass shards, but my hands were normal again. A final, long note came from the upper window. I saw a figure standing there, waving with my own hands. The Sterlings returned to find me in shock. Emily was sleeping in bed, claiming she had dreamed of music all night. The police found nothing in the attic, no piano, no dust, just an empty room with a locked door. But since that night, I can't listen to classical music. Every time I hear a piano, I feel the bones in my fingers start to ache. And sometimes, when it's perfectly quiet at night, I hear a faint, metallic chime from under my own bed, as if someone is trying to tune a string.